visible as well, so you can focus on the presentation. So obviously today we're going to be talking about the Poles and the Czechoslovakians in the Battle of Britain. So on the one hand, it is a story which is not that well known when people think about the Battle of Britain, but of course up to 1/5 of the pilots in the Battle of Britain, the fighter pilots, were non-British. So either they came from the Commonwealth, the Empire, or they came from occupied countries. Pilots who had flown to flee their country because of the German invasion. Now, specifically, I'm going to be talking today about those who came from Poland and Czechoslovakia. So I am Chris Hendricks from the RAF Museum. We are very committed to telling the story of, obviously, the RAF, the Battle of Britain, even though it is only a 6-month period in the more than 100-year period of the Royal Air Force. It is probably the defining moment, and there's no other way around it. So we've also recently opened a brand new Battle of Britain display to commemorate the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Britain. So both our London and Cosford sites have this new display, and obviously we also have an extensive collection of aircraft which participated in the Battle of Britain. So that said, today is about the Poles and Czechoslovaks in the Battle of Britain. Repeat, please. That will become a little bit apparent later on. It's actually also a phrase which became rather popular due to the Battle of Britain film of 1969, in which a Polish squadron was in the air, and suddenly, even though they were still in training, they saw a German formation and started shouting to each other, obviously in Polish, to which the commanding officer said, well, he wasn't all too happy about that. He used some languages I'm not going to repeat now, but he strongly urged them to talk English. So just to start really with the beginning, after the fall of France in June 1940, thousands of airmen from occupied Europe escaped to the United Kingdom to continue the fight against Hitler's Germany. The largest contingents came from the east, and by August that year, there were some 8,400 Polish and 900 Czechoslovak personnel stationed here. For the Poles, who had been driven from their homeland in 1939, only to be forced to flee again, Britain was the island of last hope. Prime Minister Winston Churchill was happy for the Continental Airmen to join the Royal Air Force. He sought to show the world, and especially the neutral United States, that Britain and her allies were committed to continuing and winning the war. He also knew that after suffering heavy losses in the Battle of France, the RAF was short of trained pilots and needed all the help it could get. For reasons of national prestige, the governments in exile established in London were also keen for their airmen to see action. Now, this was all very well, but few of the Poles or Czechoslovaks spoke any English, and they came from countries with cultures, customs, and traditions very different to those of their new hosts. The first Polish airmen had arrived in Britain in December 1939. They were enlisted in the RAF Volunteer Reserve and took an oath of allegiance to the King. This was later amended under the terms of the Allied Forces Act of August 1940, which afforded the Polish Air Force independent status and allowed its personnel to swear loyalty to their homeland. In practice, the Poles remained fully integrated within the structure of the RAF with regard to operational control and in matters of organization, training, and discipline. The Czechoslovaks also joined the RAF Volunteer Reserve, and there they stayed, principally because their small numbers necessitated the support of RAF ground crews. Now, the Slavs knew next to nothing about the British. One Czech pilot had read that they wore bowler hats and striped trousers, carried briefcases, and took no notice of anyone unless they were ill-treating a dog. While a Polish flyer was under the impression that the typical Englishman differed little in temperament from a fish. British were equally ignorant of the exiles, and there were some that expected they would be hopelessly uncivilized. And a good example of that is when pilot officer Vladislav Novak was invited to a lavish party, complete with orchestra, only to be asked by his well-meaning hostess if Polish people lived in houses. Amused, he and a friend borrowed two violins and established their cultural credentials by playing a Brahms duet. It should be said that Novak's country had not enjoyed a good press in Britain before the war, being presented as a prickly, militaristic state determined to preserve its independence at any cost. Now, however, British propaganda sentimentalized the Poles, portraying them as romantic cavaliers who lived only to fly and fight. The Czechoslovaks, for their part, had been memorably dismissed by Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain as a people in a faraway country of whom we know nothing. But while there may have been residual guilt in Britain at having let them down at Munich in Whitehall, Czech refugees were viewed as politically suspect. In fairness, the exiles presented very real political, social, and administrative problems at a time of grave national peril. At all levels, the language barrier had a profound effect on interaction between the East Europeans and their RAF comrades, and it raised doubts about the wisdom of attempting to integrate them into Fighter Command's complex system of command and control.
Oh, it appears that we might have lost Chris. Bear with me whilst I just try and get him.
The authority of Polish and Czechoslovak leaders, both civil and military, had been compromised by defeat, and it was by no means certain that they commanded the loyalty of their men. Worse, although the exiles had been screened by British intelligence, at least one Gestapo agent, the Czech Augustin Prekil, managed to infiltrate Fighter Command, and there may well have been others. It is perhaps understandable in this context that neither the Poles nor Czechoslovaks were initially entrusted with detailed information about the workings of radar. There were other issues to address: conflict between the relatively relaxed discipline of the RAF and the disciplinary codes of the exiles surfaced. And on one occasion, RAF officers were forced to intervene to prevent the execution by firing squad of a Czech pilot whose crime had been to damage his Hurricane in a clumsy landing. Meanwhile, a full-blown firefight flared at RAF Northolt between Polish airmen and a detachment of the Irish Guards, in which, by some miracle, no one was killed. While this and other episodes were smoothed over by the RAF, they seem to confirm the stereotypes of the Slavs as difficult and a little wild. But maybe the greatest cause for concern was the morale of the Poles and Czechoslovaks. They had been twice defeated by the Luftwaffe, and Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding, the head of Fighter Command, had misgivings about employing them, as he doubted their commitment and feared their presence in RAF squadrons would damage the morale of his men. Indeed, he appears to have envisaged the creation of Polish and Czechoslovak national squadrons as some sort of cordon sanitaire to isolate the contagion of defeatism he suspected they carried. It's worthy of note that he had no objection to exiles from Western Europe joining his squadrons. It was specifically for those of Central and Eastern Europe. And yet, despite of all of this, the Eastern Europeans were pleased to be here, and they admired the British for their courage and their efficiency. When coming to Britain, Czech airman pilot officer Thomas Vibral recorded his immediate impressions. 8th of August, 1940. Arrived in England, this is the only country that really wants to fight. Cannot compare with what has happened in France. The RAF is the best air force ever organized. So too, pilot officer Stanislav Pfeiffer, another young Czech, wrote in his diary, "We arrived at RAF Kossuth. The buildings and organizations are perfect. I'm impressed by the RAF. These people are business-minded." And he added, I just want to get on with it and get into a British fighter cockpit. Now, Pfeiffer's last comment typifies the frustration so many Polish and Czechoslovak airmen felt at being, as they saw it, sidelined into attending language classes and studying King's regulations, when they were both ready and willing to fight. Despite Dowding's reservations, which I mentioned earlier, the shortage of trained fighter pilots eventually forced him to accept the introduction of Slav airmen into British squadrons. A total of 145 Poles fought in the Battle of Britain, nearly 100 of whom served with the RAF squadrons. They were joined by 88 Czechoslovaks, roughly half serving in British units. 4 national fighter squadrons, number 310 and 312, and numbers 302 and 303 Polish squadrons. You can see the insignia of 2 of them here, were quickly formed and equipped with Hawker Hurricanes, the standard RAF fighter aircraft during the Battle of Britain. Now, each squadron was led by an RAF officer and RAF flight commanders with Polish or Czechoslovak understudies. Now, one such flight commander, Canadian Flight Lieutenant John Kent, described his disappointment at being posted to number 303 squadron. All I knew about the Polish Air Force was that it had only lasted about 3 days against the Luftwaffe, and I had no reason to suppose that they would shine any more brightly operating from England. He was to be pleasantly surprised as the Slavs set about the task of defending Britain's airspace with courage, skill, and a will to win. The first Polish victory came on 19th of July, when pilot officer Antoni Ostrovich of number 145 Squadron shared in the destruction of a Heinkel 111. Sadly, on 11th of August, he became the first of his countrymen to be killed in battle. The first victory by a national unit, that was by number 302 Squadron. You can see again the first insignia here in that board, when it shot down a Junkers 88, another German bomber. However, this was quite eclipsed by a Polish pilot who on 24th of August managed to do something quite extraordinary. His name was Sergeant Antoni Glowacki of number 501 Squadron, and he dispatched 3 Messerschmitts Me-109 fighter aircraft and 2 Junkers 88 bombers in 3 sorties in a single day, which made him an ace in a day. The Royal Air Force Museum is privileged to hold his flying logbook in its archive, and you can see a little extract from that on your screen. Flight Lieutenant Gordon Sinclair, a flight commander with number 310 Squadron, later described his men in battle. The Czechs were totally disciplined. They did what was expected of them, but not necessarily what they were told to do, because they knew instinctively what they were supposed to do. The story of number 303 Squadron's baptism of fire is probably familiar. On 30th of August, this squadron was on a routine training flight near RAF Northolt, led by squadron leader Ronald Kellett, when pilot officer Ludwik Paskiewicz spotted a formation of enemy aircraft being attacked by Hurricanes. Paskiewicz alerted Kellett's attention to the fight, but receiving no reply, he broke formation and promptly shot down a Messerschmitt Me-110, another German fighter. Now, when they landed, the Pole was reprimanded for his indiscipline and then congratulated on his success. That evening, Paskiewicz, deeply religious and a teetotaler, got drunk for the first time in his life. The following day, number 303 Squadron was declared operational. Those who have watched at some point the film The Battle of Britain may remember that scene, which is so beautifully displayed in that movie. The only Slav unit in 11 Group, 303, went on to become the most successful fighter command squadron in the battle, claiming 126 victories in only 42 days. The Battle of Britain lasted quite a bit longer, than 42 days, was an extraordinary tally. And here on this Hawker Hurricane, that is actually shown with the 126 victories and a not too bad illustration of Adolf Hitler. In common with the scores of most British squadrons, this figure would later be revised downwards. It was a very natural thing for claims to be, well, overclaimed, because you often had more than one pilot shooting at the same target. The most recent estimate being that 303 counted for some 79 enemy aircraft. That's still more than 13 per week. Inevitably, the squadron's phenomenal run of success aroused suspicion. And on one occasion, Northold's station commander, Group Captain Stanley Vincent, followed them into action to see if they were telling the truth. To his surprise, Vincent was treated to a bravura display of air fighting as the Poles took apart a large German formation over the London docks. He returned completely convinced, exclaiming to his intelligence officer, "My God, they really are doing it." With 17 confirmed victories, Sergeant Joseph František, also of 303, was one of Fighter Command's most successful pilots. František was a Czech who refused to observe air discipline, and so was allowed to fly as a guest of the squadron. This extraordinary airman would fight what was in fact a private war against the Germans until his death in a flying accident on 8th of October 1940. But he was the most successful of the fighter pilots coming from Poland or Czechoslovakia during the Battle of Britain. Now, whether serving in RAF squadrons or in their national units, the Eastern European airmen flew and fought superbly. They loved their high-performing Hurricanes and Spitfires, and they relished meeting the enemy on equal terms. Miroslav Feric, another 303 squadron pilot, described the experience of shooting down an Mi-109. "I caught up with him easily. He grew in my sights. It was time for firing. I did it quite calmly, and I was not even excited, rather puzzled and surprised to see that it was so easy. Quite different from Poland, when you had to scrape and try until you were in a sweat, and then instead of you getting the enemy, he got you." The Eastern Europeans reinforced the squadrons of Fighter Command in the crucial 5 weeks between 24th of August and 30th of September, when the shortage of pilots had become critical, and it appeared that the RAF might well lose the battle. The statistics make interesting reading. The 145 Polish pilots, representing some 5% of Fighter Command's overall strength, claimed 203 German aircraft for the loss of 29 of their number killed. This amounts to 15% of the command's total score, or 1.4 enemy aircraft for every Pole engaged. Nearly 3/4 of the Polish pilots served in 11 Group, and at the height of the battle, they constituted 10% of the group's total strength. On 15th of September, now celebrated as Battle of Britain Day, 1 in 5 of the pilots in action was Polish. The Poles were ably assisted by Czechoslovak pilots serving in British units and in number 310 squadron based at Duxford in 12 Group. The Czechs being credited with destroying 59 enemy aircraft. When they heard how well the exiles were fighting, the delighted British were generous with their praise. The King visited 303 at Northolt and signed their squadron chronicle. Or, like in this case, the Duke of Kent. In cabinet, it was said that the morale of the Polish pilots is excellent and their bravery much above the average. The British ground crews of 310 took to wearing check buttons on their tunics. Dowding admitted he was wrong about the Poles and would later write, "Had it not been for the magnificent material contributed by the Polish squadrons and their unsurpassed gallantry, I hesitate to say that the outcome of the battle would have been the same." Over the summer, the people of Britain took the East Europeans to their hearts, and young British women competed for the honor of dating a dashing Czech or Polish fighter boy. Indeed, such was the appeal of the Poles. British airmen acquired Poland shoulder flashes and spoke in broken English in the hope of improving their chances. After an uncertain start, the RAF had trusted the exiles and they had repaid that trust with interest. More Polish squadrons were formed, and by VE Day, there were 15 Polish Air Force fighter, bomber, coastal, and special duties units served by a force of 14,000 men and women. However, a total of 2,408 Poles were killed in action during the Second World War with the Polish Air Force and the Royal Air Force. The Czechoslovak contingent, on the other hand, well, that remained quite small due to recruiting difficulties. Only 4 squadrons were formed, but the quality of the men engaged might be summed up by the motto of 312 Squadron: not many, but much. Czechoslovaks served with distinction in all commands. Fortunately, out of 2,500 flying personnel, 511 were killed. Sadly, whereas the airmen from Western Europe returned to their homelands as the liberators, the Poles and later the Czechoslovaks watched helplessly as their countries were taken over by the communists. As those that returned home risked death or imprisonment, most opted to remain in Britain or to begin new lives abroad. A few hundred of the Slavs were readmitted to the peacetime RAF, where some, such as Air Vice Marshal Alec Meissner, a Pole, continued to serve into the 1970s. The contribution of the Poles and the Czechoslovak airmen to victory in the Battle of Britain was disproportionate to their numbers. But what made them so good? 3 main factors may be identified. First, their training. Second, their experience. And third, their motivation. Now, about the first part, the training, although the pre-war Polish Air Force was small and poorly equipped, they boasted some of the best trained pilots in the world. Entry into the Air Force Academy at Deblin was extremely competitive, and cadets underwent a rigorous medical examination, which eliminated all but the very best. Training was demanding for the cadets and conditions austere. It toughened them up physically and mentally. As one pilot later wrote, "Those 4 years gave me a lifetime's armor plating." The gunnery of Polish Air Force fighter pilots was exceptional. And for maximum effect, they were trained to fly very close to the enemy before opening fire. Pilots also practiced flying straight at one another, only braking at the last possible moment as a way of gauging distance and developing nerve. Though traditionally individualistic, the Poles placed emphasis on team fighting and on the importance of going to the aid of a comrade in danger. Incidentally, Sergeant František, the Czech pilot of 303 Squadron, František's notorious lack of discipline was not appreciated by his comrades, who only hit on the solution of letting him fly as a guest of 303 Squadron, as an option to having him posted off the squadron altogether. This aircraft here that you see on the screen, that is a PZL 37, which was one of their more modern aircraft. It's a light bomber aircraft, very similar to what the British had in the form of a Bristol Blenheim. While their bomber aircraft were quite modern, it was especially their fighter aircraft which were hopelessly obsolete. So for the Polish pilots to some extent, to a lesser extent, one would say, the Czechoslovak pilots coming to Britain, the transition towards the more modern Hurricane and Spitfire was, well, somewhat challenging and could only be overcome by the simple reason that these pilots were highly trained and highly motivated. Another very great difference between the technology of these countries with that what they saw with the RAF was for instance, the radio telephony. So in these aircraft, there was there were no radios or very limited radios, while RAF aircraft were standard equipped with powerful and reliable radios. But this was in a way also a blessing, because the Poles and the Czechs could not rely on this kind of communication. They had to work together much more efficiently, and also pretty much have a clear communication, even visually. Now, the Czechoslovak Air Force, in a way very similar, also highly selective. For instance, in 1933, only 22 cadets from the military academy at Renachi progressed to advanced aircrew training. Those that stayed the exacting year-long course found themselves posted to the highly motivated and relatively competitive Czechoslovak Air Force. By the time of the Munich crisis of September 1938, the Czechoslovak Air Force was composed of 6 regional air regiments and equipped with more than 1,500 aircraft, 800 of which were frontline combat aircraft. With the German occupation half a year later, the Czechoslovak Air Force was disbanded and 470 airmen escaped to France and were temporarily enlisted in the French Foreign Legion. Further, 93 airmen, including Sergeant František, were accepted into the ranks of the Polish Air Force. With the outbreak of war on the 1st of September 1939, the Polish Air Force 300 mostly obsolete aircraft were opposed by the German Luftwaffe, equipped with over 1,300 modern fighters and bombers. Polish Air Force squadrons were not, however, destroyed on the ground in the first days of the campaign, as is often thought and can be read in war literature. Instead, they had intelligently dispersed to forward airfields located around the country. The Polish pilots fought well and in the brief campaign managed to shoot down 126 enemy machines for the loss of 114 of their own. But again, their aircraft were much inferior in quality. Following the Soviet invasion and the German victory just a few weeks later, most of the airmen left Poland and were interned in camps in Romania, Hungary, and elsewhere before escaping to France to continue the war. Once there, their superior training and that most precious commodity, combat experience, stood them in good stead. Although only engaged in the latter part of the Battle of France, Polish pilots destroyed 56 German aircraft. The Czechoslovak airmen were allowed to leave the Foreign Legion to join the French Air Force, and they acquitted themselves well in the Battle of France, claiming 100 enemy aircraft for the loss of 18 killed. By the time they reached this country, the Slav pilots had undergone what has been characterized as a process of natural selection. In other words, those that had experienced Blitzkrieg twice and survived, well, they clearly had something going for them. Of course, flying with the RAF was very different to anything they had experienced up to that point, and their poor English impeded their progress. In addition, the novelty of imperial rather than metric measures, an aircraft with retractable undercarriages, caused a number of minor accidents. Nevertheless, in spite of these problems, the word coming out of the operational training units in July 1940 was that the Slavs were very good and that they were flying their Spitfires and Hurricanes to the limit. The exiles knew they were very good, and they were, moreover, highly critical of the RAF's outmoded battle formations and tactics. Rather than adopting the inflexible parade ground VIC, which is a formation in the shape of a V, they had learned to fly in more open formations. Their tactics were more versatile than the RAF's clumsy fighting area attacks. Trained to get in close, the Poles made the most of their 8 rifle caliber machine guns. All of the Hurricanes on number 303 squadron had their guns harmonized to converge at 200 yards rather than the standard 400 yard spread or the 250 yards favored by more experienced British pilots. However, while the Poles and Czechoslovaks fought with aggression, they were far from the suicidal cavaliers of legend. They had both the confidence and the ability to take calculated risks, but they were not reckless. Indeed, 303 and 303 each lost only 8 pilots in the campaign, a casualty figure much lower than that of most other squadrons. The Czechoslovaks, for their part, suffered only 9 pilots killed. I've been talking so far almost exclusively about the pilots, but most Poles served as ground personnel, and here too they were highly skilled, and their dedication, efficiency, and capacity for hard work made for high rates of serviceability on the 2 national squadrons. The ground crew's finest hour came after the fighting on 15th of September, when 303 Squadron's flying officer Verkovic and his team managed overnight to restore 9 apparently unrepairable hurricanes for the next day's operation. As for motivation, the contribution of the Polish and Czechoslovak airmen must be seen against the backdrop of the Nazi occupation of Eastern Europe and its attendant horrors. The exiles received enough information from their homeland to know that those they loved lived under constant threat of arrest, deportation, and execution. To protect people at home, the airmen used assumed names or covered their faces when posing for photographs. Here we see Flying Officer Jan Daszewski of 303 Squadron doing just that. Czechoslovakia suffered less in comparison, but in excess of 350,000 people that were killed by the Germans. Nazi Germany's long-term aim was slightly different than that which was projected for Poland, and yet both the Czechs and the Poles were absolutely convinced that they were the ones who needed to save their country from Nazi occupation. Hate drove some of the Slavs to shoot enemy airmen in their parachutes, a habit they claimed they had learned from the Germans in 1939. Many of the Slavs found comfort and strength in religion, and for all the pain and suffering they had experienced, few doubted that God was on their side. On 27th of September, Ludwik Paskiewicz was killed, and his friend, pilot officer Jan Zumbak, ordinary a cynic with a sharp wit, wrote, "He gave his life high up there, somewhere where earthly matters are so distant, the rays of the sun so pure, and God so close." On the 2nd of September 1940, 303 Squadron was involved in a combat near Dover, in which one pilot, Sergeant Jan Rogowski, and he's the one now outlined in yellow, demonstrated the qualities that set the Eastern European airmen apart. According to the combat report held in the archive at the RAF Museum, the squadron was patrolling at 19,000 feet when Rogowski saw a formation of 9 Me-109s at 22,000 feet, diving down on them out of the sun. Instantly assessing the situation, he delivered a head-on attack, which broke and dispersed the Germans. In a fierce battle over the channel, Rogowski and Sergeant František each shot down a Messerschmitt. Pilot officer Henneberg probably destroyed another, and pilot officer Feric damaged the fourth. In doing so, Feric's engine was disabled, and so shutting it down, he prepared to attempt to glide back across the sea to England. Sergeant Rogowski immediately took station as his escort. Both were in turn covered by other pilots until Feric effected a forced landing and on British soil. In combat, it was typically a Pole that saw the enemy first. The RAF officers leading the squadron are not mentioned in the report. Typically, Rogowski had the courage, the skill, and the confidence to take a calculated risk, which, on this occasion, paid off handsomely. Typically, he then made the most of his advantage, shooting down a Messerschmitt himself while the others successfully engaged the enemy. And typically, he stayed with his stricken comrade until he was sure he was safe. The squadron's British intelligence officer, Flying Officer Hedwin, was suitably impressed, and he wrote, "The Polish pilots showed up very well in this action, working in an intelligent combination and pressing their attack right home. Sergeant Rogowski deserves special commendation for his quick and courageous attack, which probably saved the squadron from what might have been a disastrous surprise. So again, to sum up, it would be easy to portray Jan Rogowski and his Polish and Czechoslovak comrades as supermen, but this was far from the case. They were, however, highly trained, highly experienced, and highly motivated professionals on top of their game. To its credit, the RAF was quick to recognize the caliber of the men serving with them, and it should be congratulated for allowing the exiles their head. The Air Force was also meritocratic, and it is perhaps enough to say that it encouraged the best and the brightest of two principled, courageous, and resourceful nations to participate fully in the defense of Britain and of what remained of European civilization. Let the last words be those of Johnny Kent, who I hope you will remember, was originally reluctant to serve with the Poles, saying that he very much doubted they would do any better than those 3 days they opposed the Germans in 1939. On leaving 303 Squadron, he added the following to the Squadron Chronicle. Best wishes and all the luck in the world to the finest squadron in the whole world, and with profound thanks for keeping me alive and teaching me to fight. He appears to have meant it, for not long after he broke the nose of a British Army officer unwise enough to refuse to stand for the Polish national anthem. And that is the presentation that I had for you today.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was really informative, and the stories were incredible, and the photos really made it come to life. So we're really grateful for your time. We've had lovely comments here, comments from Roy about how important the sessions have been for him, and particularly how lovely this one was. So thank you, Chris, for joining us. And I hope everyone on the session has had a good afternoon, as I enjoyed the last 40 minutes of Chris's conversation. We've had a few round of applause there and thumbs up. Usually at this point I say, you know, looking forward to next week's Project Entertain, but Chris, you have joined us for a momentous one where we're at the end of week 26 and we are pausing Project Entertain in the current format. So Chris, thank you so much for joining us and for informing and educating and inspiring all our listeners today, and thank you everyone for coming along to this and every other session as well. If you wanted to catch up on what we've been up to, you can go to projectentertain@rafa.org.uk, or you can email opconnect at opconnect@rafa.org.uk. Thank you, Chris. Have a lovely weekend, and I look forward to seeing you all in the future.
All right. See you next time. Bye.